We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
Subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell. Turn on every notification.
There are new reports suggesting that the search for Nancy Guthrie may have entered a different phase. But at this stage, there has been no official confirmation of what that shift actually means. And that uncertainty is where the story now begins. Because over the past several days, activity near a previously searched area appears to have increased. Not dramatically, but enough to raise questions. According to available information, personnel have returned to a location that had already been examined earlier in the investigation. The same general area connected to that early digital signal, the one that appeared briefly during the early morning hours, and then disappeared. At the time, it was treated cautiously, just one data point among many. Now, it appears to be getting a second look. Think about that for a moment. Investigations rarely return to the same ground without a reason. Time matters, resources matter, and each decision to revisit a location is usually tied to something that wasn't fully resolved the first time. So when attention shifts back to a specific place, it often means something didn't sit right. And that shift is starting to show. Because alongside this renewed activity, there has also been a noticeable change in how the search itself is being approached. Less focus on wide area coverage. More attention on specific points. That doesn't confirm anything on its own, but it does suggest that the investigation may be narrowing. And when a case begins to narrow, the questions begin to change. Instead of asking where someone could be, the focus becomes whether investigators are now looking in the right place. And that brings everything back to the digital trail. Because from the beginning, one detail stood apart. The movement recorded during that early morning window, a signal appearing at a location roughly 2 miles away, at a time that has never been fully explained. At first, it was treated as a possibility. Now, it may be something more. Because if that same location is now being revisited, then it suggests that it is no longer being treated as incidental. It is being treated as relevant. But relevant to what that remains? Unclear. There has been no confirmed discovery, no verified indication that Nancy has been found, and no official statement explaining what, if anything, has changed. So the question remains open. Has something actually been located, or is this simply a more focused search? Because those are two very different situations. And right now, the line between them is not clearly defined. At the same time, attention has begun to return to individuals already known to the case, including her son-in-law, Tommaso, not as a conclusion, but as part of the ongoing review, because earlier in the investigation, his phone records introduced a detail that could not be easily explained. Movement during a period when he reported being at home, a connection to a location outside his known routine, and the presence of a second signal that has still not been identified. At the time, those details were treated as inconsistencies. Now, in light of renewed attention on that same location, they may be viewed differently, not as isolated points, but as part of a sequence that is still being examined. And this is where the case begins to shift, not toward certainty, but toward focus. Because if investigators are returning to that location now, then they may be working with something they didn't have before. Not necessarily a conclusion, but enough to justify another look. And in cases like this, a second look can mean one of two things. Either something was missed, or something new has emerged. At this stage, there is no public confirmation of which one it is, but the direction of the investigation suggests that it is no longer moving broadly. It is concentrating. And when that happens, even small details begin to matter more. Because they are no longer just possibilities. They are being tested, measured, compared against what is already known. So the question now is not just whether something has been found. It's whether investigators are getting closer to understanding what happened in the first place. Because if this renewed focus is tied to that original signal, then the digital trail may be doing more than raising questions. It may be pointing somewhere specific. But until that is confirmed, everything remains in a careful space between possibility and proof. And that leaves one question at the center of it all. If investigators are returning to that location now, what is it that they believe might still be there? If investigators are returning to that location, then the question is not just why, it's what changed. Because in most investigations, a second search is rarely routine. It is usually driven by something new, not always a major discovery. Sometimes, it's a detail that didn't fully make sense the first time, a pattern that only becomes clear when placed alongside other pieces of information. And in this case, that pattern appears to center around one specific window, the early morning hours, when the timeline begins to separate. Because that is where the physical scene and the digital records stop aligning, where movement is suggested but not clearly explained. And where that signal first appeared, that moment has remained unresolved from the beginning. But now, with attention returning to the same location, it may be taking on new meaning. And that brings the focus back to how digital evidence is interpreted. Because a signal doesn't just show where a device connects. It reflects behavior. It reflects movement. And sometimes, it reflects absence. Moments where a device stops communicating entirely. Those silent intervals. At first, they can be easy to overlook. But over time, they begin to stand out. Because they represent the moments no one can directly account for. No signal. No confirmation. Only a gap. And if that gap aligns with a location now being revisited, then it raises a different kind of question. Not just where a device was, but what may have been happening while it wasn't transmitting anything at all. Think about that for a moment. A device moves, it connects, then it goes silent, and sometime later, activity resumes. That sequence, on its own, doesn't prove anything. But when placed alongside physical movement, it begins to suggest intent, not clearly, not definitively, but enough to justify a closer look. And that appears to be what is happening now. Because returning to a location is not just about repeating a search. It's about testing a theory, re-examining the area with a different understanding of what might matter, looking not just for obvious evidence, but for anything that may have been overlooked the first time. Subtle disturbances, changes in terrain, objects that don't belong, details that only become visible when you know where to look. At the same time, the timeline is being reviewed again, not from the beginning, but from the point where everything begins to diverge, because that is where the key questions remain. And one of those questions still centers on the second signal, that brief presence detected in the same general area during that same window. It has never been identified, and that lack of identification continues to matter because it introduces the possibility that more than one device and more than one person may have been present. At this stage, there is no confirmed connection between those signals, but the fact that they overlap in time and location is not being ignored, especially now, as that same location becomes the focus again. And that is where the investigation begins to narrow. Not toward a conclusion, but toward a point of concentration. Because when multiple elements begin to align around a single place, it becomes difficult to treat that alignment as coincidence. The signal, the silence, the second presence, each one, on its own, may not be enough, but together, they begin to form a pattern, and that pattern is now influencing where attention is being directed. Still, there are limits to what can be confirmed, because until something is formally identified, everything remains within the boundaries of analysis, possibility, interpretation, and that is where the case stands now. There is renewed activity, there is a location drawing focus, and there is a timeline that still contains a gap, but there is still no official confirmation of what, if anything, has been discovered. Which brings the investigation back to its central question. If something has changed, what is it that investigators are now seeing that they didn't see before? And more importantly, what are they expecting to find this time? By this stage, the investigation is no longer expanding. It is concentrating. And when a case reaches that point, the shift is subtle but significant. Because early on, investigators move outward. They follow leads in multiple directions. They test possibilities. But over time, that process changes. The search becomes narrower, more deliberate, guided less by speculation and more by what continues to hold up under review. And right now, one location appears to be holding that attention. The same area connected to that early signal. The same place, now being revisited. That doesn't confirm a discovery, but it does suggest that something about that location continues to align with the evidence. And alignment matters, because in investigations like this, conclusions are not built from a single detail. They come from patterns, from multiple elements pointing in the same direction. The recorded movement, the unexplained gap in the timeline, the presence of a second signal, and now renewed activity in that same area. Each of those elements, on its own, leaves room for interpretation, but together, they begin to narrow the possibilities. Not completely, but enough to change how the case is being approached. And that change brings a different kind of pressure. Because when attention focuses on a single point, expectations begin to shift, not publicly, but within the investigation itself. What was once uncertain becomes something that needs to be resolved. And that resolution depends on what is or isn't found during this renewed effort. At the same time, the earlier timeline is being viewed differently, not just as a sequence of events, but as something that may need to be reconsidered entirely. Because if something did occur at that location, then the events leading up to it may not be separate details. They may be connected, part of a sequence that was not fully understood the first time. And this is where the investigation reaches a difficult space. Because the data suggests direction, but not confirmation. It points toward a possibility, but does not establish proof. And until that proof exists, everything remains in balance. Between what is suspected and what can actually be stated, that distinction is critical. Because in cases like this, assumptions can move faster than evidence. And once that happens, it becomes harder to separate fact from interpretation. So the investigation continues in a controlled way. Methodical, measured, focused on verifying what can be confirmed and setting aside what cannot. But even within that careful approach, one reality is becoming harder to ignore. The case is no longer moving in multiple directions. It is moving toward something specific, whether that leads to a confirmed discovery or simply eliminates another possibility, remains to be seen. But either outcome brings the investigation closer to an answer. And that answer may depend on what is uncovered in a place that has already been searched once before. Which brings everything back to one final question. If investigators are returning to that same location now, what is it that they believe might still be there? Because if that location is as relevant as it now appears, then this may not just be about where Nancy Guthrie is. It may be about whether the answer has been connected to that location from the very beginning. And if that's the case, then the next discovery may not come from a new lead. It may come from finally understanding one that was already there, waiting to be seen.